So good evening again, here from Grazotopia at Forum Stadtpark in Graz. Today's lecture is going to be in English because we have some guests who do not speak German. I'm very glad to welcome Philipp Dapprich, our lecturer today. Philipp is a philosopher and a political economist, currently at the researcher and lecturer at the University of Düsseldorf. He did his PhD at the University of Glasgow, and his topic, the topic of his PhD, and also the topic on which he has been working for years, and that he's going to talk about also this evening, is the application of digital computational tools for some kind of new planned economy or new socialist, new model of socialist planning that also considers ecological and other restraints. I'm very excited to hear Philipp's proposal, and also looking forward to the discussion after that. Thank you, Philipp. And
thank you very much. What I'll be presenting is not just my model of how sort of computer algorithm-based planning of a socialist economy could work, but also some results from a computer simulation of that model that I actually implemented. So I'll be able to share that with you as well. But before I start with that, I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the background influences on my model. And then I'll be presenting sort of how the model and how the simulation of the model that I implemented work. And we'll go through that sort of step by step. And then in the end, we'll look at some results and the relevance of these results. So something about the background. There's, of course, this idea of socialist planning, which I trace back at least to sort of Marx and Engels, that had this idea of a universal planning of production. So you have not just a production plan for an individual enterprise, but you plan production of the entire economy. And of course, this has already been tried in various forms in Eastern socialist countries, for example. And here, what was often used is this method of material balancing. And the primary concern here is to create a balance between inputs and outputs of production processes. So for example, car manufacturing requires steel as an input to produce cars. This material balancing method then makes sure that the output of steel from the steel industry is sufficient for the steel consumption of the car industry, right? So they wanted to make sure that they don't have a plan which requires more steel for car manufacturing than steel is actually being produced by the steel furnaces. Okay, and the material balancing method did a reasonable job of that. So you did in the end have a plan which, at least in theory, was consistent and was feasible in terms of balancing these inputs and outputs of various industries. But Leonid Kantorovich, who you have been seeing on the right here, he was a Soviet mathematician and economist, and he basically discovered that just because a plan is somehow feasible and balanced doesn't mean it is in any sense optimal. But he found that a lot of problems, or economic problems that would be found in such a planned economy could be formulated as a certain kind of mathematical optimization problem. And these are linear optimization problems. The problem that he faced was that these kinds of problems could not be solved with sort of traditional mathematical analysis. It was simply not possible to directly derive a solution. But he wasn't completely deterred by that, and he found out that you can approach an optimal solution to these kinds of problems with an algorithmic method, which approximates the optimal solution in a step-by-step process. So you have a solution which isn't quite optimal, but then you improve it a bit, and you get closer to an optimal solution, and you improve it further. And after a finite number of steps, you then do get an optimal solution to the problem. Right? It was just that the classical methods of mathematics weren't able to do it, but with such an algorithmic method, it was no problem. And these kinds of problems were then later independently solved in the West. But since Kantorowicz was actually the first to develop a solution for these kinds of problems, specifically with economic planning in the Soviet Union in mind, he was then awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, and as far as I know, he's actually the only sort of socialist and only Soviet economist also who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. There's another sort of chain of thought which goes into my model, and this relates to distribution, so how consumer products are distributed in a socialist society. And here you have this idea of labor vouchers, which has long been discussed in the socialist movement. Marx probably most famously discussed this. So the idea being that workers receive a certain number of vouchers for their work, which can then be redeemed for a certain amount of consumer products, a certain number of consumer products. In the market socialist tradition, it was then suggested that instead of using labor time prices for these consumer goods, which is what Marx and most previous socialists discussed, so the prices of goods would be fixed at the average socially necessary labor time needed to produce them, market socialists instead suggested that they would be flexible and that you would adapt the prices towards market clearing prices. So market clearing prices or clearing rates are those rates at which supply and demand match, which means at the end of the day, you don't have any sort of product left, which might go to waste. But it's also not the case that the supermarket shelves run out prematurely, and at the end of the day, there are still people coming to wanting to buy a product for this price, but they can't simply buy it because it's run out, right? So market clearing prices avoid this by being sort of just the right price, where just as many people want to purchase the good as there are goods available of a certain type. And then a complete model which kind of combines these two approaches was put forward by Paul Cockshott, who was also my PhD supervisor, and Alan Cottrell in their book Towards a New Socialism. And what they suggested is basically you can have this sort of optimized production planning, but you adapt the plan target to consumer behavior. So instead of a central committee or some central planning agency deciding what's going to be produced, this will be adapted to what consumers demand. And labor values are here used as cost indicators to show whether prices for a product are high or low, and which then leads one to adapt the planning target. I'll go into more detail about this later. But what I've criticized about this is that labor values simply ignore other factors than labor, which are necessary to produce things. And what I'm interested in particular is greenhouse gas emissions. So some products might require more greenhouse gases than others, and I think this should also be reflected in the cost. So instead, I developed a different system of values based on opportunity cost, which I'll also be explaining today. Okay, so I'll first give you now an overview of my model and the simulation of it, for then sort of going through each of these step by step. So this is just sort of the picture to begin with. We have a planning target, which kind of specifies what kind of consumer products or what kind of products are going to be produced. Then you have then you calculate an optimal production plan, which produces as much as possible of these. Then you know how much you can supply to consumers, how many consumer goods can be supplied to consumers. You then adapt the price towards market clearing prices for the goods, compare the market clearing prices to the cost values of the goods, and then adjust the plan target. Okay, so this is quite a lot to take in. So we'll go through each of these steps one by one, and hopefully then it gets a bit clearer. So we start with a plan target. And the plan target is basically a table like this, which specifies for each kind of product in the economy the proportions at which these are supposed to be produced, right? So in this example, for every 6 units of corn, you would produce 7 units of coal and 10 units of bread. Okay, so these are sort of proportions which for the moment are fixed, but will be changed later on, right? At which consumer products are going to be produced. But this only considers the portion of a product intended for end consumers. So this doesn't consider the corn which is needed to bake bread, right? Or the coal that's burned to bake bread. It only considers the part which will actually then be made available to consumers. Hold on. Okay. And this then also means that there's an entry of 0 for products which are not used by end consumers, which are only used in industry. Okay. It doesn't mean there won't be any iron in this case that will be produced. It just means that iron is not used by end consumers. It's only used in industry to make other things, okay? So this is the plan target, basically just proportions at which consumer products are supposed to be produced. And you then want to calculate an optimal production plan. Okay, but this plan must, of course, consider what's possible, certain constraints on production. And for this, you first of all have, so these constraints ensure that no more materials are used than are available or are being produced, right? So the production plan shouldn't use more corn than is being produced by farmers. And it shouldn't use more iron than is being produced by iron mining and so on, okay? So that's the purpose of these constraints, to make sure that the production plan in the end is feasible. And you then have an input table, which is what you see here on the right. And this specifies various methods of productions and what inputs they require. So for farming, I mean, in this very simplified example, of course, there's only a couple of production methods, and there's only one method of farming, and it requires some corn as seed, and then some energies in the form of coal, maybe. As I said, this is a simplified example. Some machinery, which is here simplified as iron. It doesn't require bread, but it does require labor, of course, right? So all these production methods require different kinds of inputs. And then you have further tables which specify what kind of products do these methods produce. And you also have a table which specifies certain limited resources, like land, for example, which might just be limited. Also, what I will be working with is in particular labor that is limited, right? There's a limited amount of time that people can spend working. And also you can introduce a deliberate constraint on CO2 emissions. So the idea here is you can just cap how many greenhouse gas emissions are permissible, and the algorithm will then find the production plan which maximizes production without exceeding this emissions limit. And constraints are then based on these tables and formulated as linear inequalities. So that's what you see here at the bottom. Don't worry if you don't quite understand it, but basically this means that there can't be sort of less output of something than is used of coal, for example, than is being used as input at other production processes, right? To make sure that, you know, the plan doesn't say we have to use 1,000 tons of coal, but we're actually just producing 500, which would mean it's not possible. And similarly, it makes sure that we don't use more of limited resources like land, labor, or CO2 emission rights, if that is deliberately kept, than is specified in this resource table. Okay, and then there are also further inequalities, further such constraints, which ensure that the proportions of the plan target we saw earlier are kept, right? So we have this table specifying that you get 7 units of coal for every 6 units of corn. This is also specified in such an inequality and makes sure that the plan you get in the end is actually at those proportions. Okay, there's something wrong with my PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so we have the constraints under which the optimization has to take place. But now an optimization is always in mathematics, the maximization of some function. So you have some mathematical function and you want to find the maximum value of it. And this function is called the objective function. And the objective function in my model is given by the output of an arbitrary product. So this can be any of the consumer products in the economy. It doesn't really matter which one. We can take corn, for example. And the optimized plan then maximizes the objective function, finds the production plan basically, which maximizes output of that product without violating any of the constraints. This keeps the proportions specified in the plan target because those are implemented in the constraints. And that's also why it doesn't matter which product we choose, because if we maximize the production of corn, but we produce 7 units of coal for every 6 units of corn, then we also maximize at the same time the production of coal and all other consumer products, because they are all linked together anyway, okay, at certain proportions. And then you have a linear programming problem, and this can today be solved with freeware such as LP-solve. LP-solve is what I use. This is based on sort of the Western variant of linear programming. So this is not precisely the method used by Leonid Kantorovich in the Soviet Union, but basically achieves the same thing and is more widely available today. Okay, so we now have an optimized production plan. This optimized production plan basically tells us what production methods do we have to use at which sort of degree to produce as much as possible at the given proportions. And this then also tells us how many consumer products are we in the end gonna end up producing that can be made available to consumers. So this then tells us the supply of consumer goods that can be marketed to consumers. And what then happens is that these consumer products are offered at certain prices to consumers, right, who can choose whether or not with their budget they want to purchase these consumer products or not. Of course, in my computer simulation, I don't have real consumers. So I worked with sort of a very simple agent-based model. So basically, I modeled the behavior of these consumers. It's not a very realistic model of how consumers behave, but it kind of shows you how the plan algorithm will adapt to various consumption behavior. And what happens then is, so you start off on the top right here in the circle with some price, which should be a reasonable price for the product, but it will still be adapted, right? So you start off with some price and you see, well, how many people are willing to purchase this product at the given price. And then you know the demand, right? That's the demand. How many people are demanding this product at the given price? And you compare that to the supply. How many of this product are we currently producing under our economic plan, right? On our production plan. Then you adjust the price. So if demand exceeds supply, then you have to increase the price. And if demand is lower than supply, then you lower the price. Okay. And of course, then consumers will adjust their demand based on this. And this is repeated several times. In my simulation, I've done this, I think, 30 times, representing about 1 month, right? And you relatively quickly approach market clearing prices at which supply and demand balance. Okay, and now you have these market clearing prices, which show you a bit about how high in demand this product is. So if the price is really high, then a lot of people seem to be very interested in this product, are willing to spend quite a large part of their budget on it. But if the price is low, people aren't really that interested. The question is, the price is high or low relative to what? Okay, so you need some kind of indicator of what a high price or low price is for a certain product. So this will be different for laptops than it is for apples, because apples can be produced relatively easily en masse, while laptops take a lot more effort to produce and a lot more various raw materials, right? But what is the right kind of value or cost for a product? And here I've come up with the idea of using opportunity costs for this. So I asked myself the question, well, what is the opportunity cost for 1 unit of a product? Or another way to put this, opportunity cost means kind of what is being lost. What opportunities are being lost when we consume 1 unit of this product or use resources to produce 1 unit of this product? And the way to also ask this is, well, how could these resources, which go into making a laptop, how could they be used instead if one laptop or 1 unit of a product could sort of be produced for free without having to use any resources to make it, any labor, right? That would free up certain resources which are no longer required for making this laptop, which could then be used for something else. And I asked myself, well, what else could be produced with this? And well, the way that you then derive actual sort of measurable values from this is, well, you really assume that 1 unit of a product is produced for free. So here you have the free bread method. And these are all this is the input table again, which shows you for all the methods what inputs they require, okay? And the free bread method produces 1 unit of bread. It doesn't require any inputs. There's no labor required, there's no corn required, right? It's magically just appears, this 1 unit of bread. But I make sure that this can only be used to produce exactly 1 unit. So you can't use this more than once. Just 1 unit of bread can be produced in this sort of magical way. Okay. And what happens then is that the objective function increases ever so slightly, because this unit of bread is available for free, so the labor and the other resources which would be needed to produce it can now be used to produce other things. And so what you see is that the value of the optimized objective function increases slightly from, in one example that I calculated, 1161.6 to 1161.45. So very slight increase. And this slight increase is then the value of 1 unit of bread. So the value of 1 unit of bread would be 0.19. Okay. And then similarly, you can calculate values for corn and coal, which in this example were 0.31 and 0.32 respectively. So this shows you, well, 1 unit of corn has a very similar value to 1 unit of coal, but they both have a much higher value than 1 unit of bread in this instant, okay? And towards a new socialism model, which my model is kind of an adaptation of, simply uses labor values instead. So they simply use the average socially necessary labor time to produce something. And I, in my simulation, tried both out and compared them, and we'll look at that in shortly. Okay, so we now know how the cost values are calculated. We have the market clearing prices of the products, and now we want to adjust the plan target, which, as you might recall, are the proportions at which various consumer products are supposed to be produced. So this is the original plan target. Okay, we have 6 units of corn, 7 units of coal, 10 units of bread. And what you do now to adjust this plan target is, well, first you make the values, the cost values we just calculated, you make them directly comparable to prices. Never mind right now how that is done, but basically it's so that they are on the same scale. And if the price of a product is now below the value, then the corresponding plan target is reduced by 1%. Because if the price is very low, it shows people aren't really that interested in this product and we should be producing less of it. Okay. And this is what you see in the case of coal here. So obviously, the price of coal in this example was very low. So the plan target was reduced from 7 to 6.93, was reduced by 1%. But if the price is above the value, then the plan target is increased by 1%. Because if people are willing to pay a very high price for something, it shows that they have significant need for this. They're willing to pay quite a lot for it. So it justifies increasing production of this kind of product. And this is what in this case you see with corn and bread, right? So that price for these products was above their values. So the next plan target gets increased by 1% in both cases. Okay. And now you have a new plan target, and the whole cycle starts again. You can again calculate an optimized production plan, but with this new plan target. And then over time, the plan target will always adjust to consumer demand. That's the idea anyway. Okay, I'll show you now. I'll now show you some results from my simulation and what I think the relevance of the whole thing is. So this is one case I considered, and what you see here is basically so there's a very simplified case, an economy with only 2 types of consumer products, and the reason is that you can display this graphically quite nicely, as you can see here. So the tip of an arrow shows us how much is being produced of each consumer product. So with a black arrow, we get about 2,500 of product A and about 2,500 of product B. Okay, that's what we're seeing here. So we only have 2 products, A and B. But product A in this case requires significant greenhouse gas emissions. So this is very has very adverse climate effects producing this product. While product B requires much less emissions. Okay, so that's the more environmentally friendly alternative. And in the black arrow, we see what happens if there's no constraint on emissions. And so the economy is basically allowed to emit as much CO2 as it wants, right? With no limit on this. And that's what happens in the black case. And that happens whether you use labor values as cost indicators or my opportunity cost valuations. In both cases, you get exactly the same thing, okay? In red, we then see what happens in the labor value model. We use labor values as cost indicators, but now we reduce an emission constraint. So we say we can't be emitting more than a certain amount of CO2 during production. And what happens in this case is that the proportions of A and B remain exactly the same. So we're still producing at the same proportions. We just produce less of both. That's why the red arrow is still in the same direction, but it's just sort of slightly shorter. Okay, so we now produce around 2000 of A and 2000 of B. I don't think that makes sense because as we limit emissions, we don't just want to produce the same kind of things, just less of it. We also want to adapt to this new reality that emissions are now have to be limited and produce significantly less of things which require a lot of emissions, but perhaps even more of things which don't require as many emissions, or just we can still produce just as much of them. And that's precisely what happens in the green arrow, which is when you use my opportunity cost values. What happens in this case is that production over time is adjusted towards more of product B, or relatively more of product B, but much less of product A is now being produced. Okay, and that's why you get this shift in the direction of the arrow towards product B, which is the more environmentally friendly one. And that's sort of exactly what I was going for with my model and was able to show in this simulation is indeed what happens. I tried out some other cases, and I even had one case, which you can see here, where with labor values, actually the exact opposite happened of what you would want to happen. So actually here, the labor value model started producing more of the environmentally, or relatively more of the environmentally destructive product A, and less of, much less of product B, which is kind of the opposite of what you want to happen, okay? And this happens where you change some parameters, so there's some alternative production methods, but clearly the opposite of what you want to happen happens here. Okay, so what's the relevance of all of this? Well, I think the simulation, on the one hand, demonstrates how optimized production planning can be coupled with consumer feedback, right? So you don't need some planning committee to decide what consumer products are going to be produced, but this will be automatically adapted to what consumers demand. You also can compare the two versions, one based on labor values, the other based on opportunity cost. And you can see that both of them basically allow you to constrain emissions. So that's simply an additional linear constraint, which is built into the model. And both models can deal with that, no problem. So there won't be more emissions than a certain amount. Okay, that's the case in both models. But the resulting plan targets differ in that the opportunity cost model emphasizes low emission products, while the labor value model doesn't as clearly make such an adoption. Okay, so there are some further problems with this, of course. One is that my method of valuation is very computationally complex. And this has to do is because you need, this is so because you need an additional optimization to calculate each value of each consumer product. So if you have 10 million consumer products, you're going to have to calculate an optimal production plan 10 million times. And while one is perfectly fine, you can calculate that in sufficiently fast with the modern supercomputer. doing this like 10 million times or something along those lines, that would just take too much time. But there are a few ways that we might address this. First of all, Paul Cockshott developed an harmony algorithm, he calls it, which is sort of his optimization method, which is more efficient than conventional linear optimization. And also I've started to think about sort of other ways of determining these values, which would be very similar, but calculated basically in a more efficient way. Another problem is, well, there's some limitations with the consumer model that I use just in the simulation, right? The behavior of consumers is only in a limited way realistic. But this isn't really a problem when applying this in the real world, because in the real world, this would be real people going to the supermarket deciding what they want to buy for dinner, so to say, okay? There's another limitation in my simulation, which is that it currently doesn't allow for economic growth, which some people might also consider a good thing, but has to do also with a more general limitation that capital stocks are fixed in the simulation at the moment. But there are methods for planning expansion of production and changes in the capital stock as well, which exist in the literature, but which I have not implemented in the simulation yet. So we still need a model which combines sort of this long-term planning, which also allows for economic growth or changes in capital stock, which combines that with consumer feedback. Okay, that doesn't exist in the literature yet, as far as I know. And then there's also limitations of the various control mechanisms I use. So this refers to, for example, by how much prices are adapted if there's a mismatch between supply and demand. By how much do you change the planning target due to a mismatch between prices and opportunity cost valuations, okay? And this could still be improved to make sure that this approaches an equilibrium condition much faster by using more complex controllers or fine-tuning some parameters. Or also what I've been considering is implying machine learning here, which would be able to sort of find optimal solutions to these kinds of problems much quicker. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I very much look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Philipp, for presenting this super interesting model. I'm sure that there are many questions. At least I do have some, but I would like, of course, first to give an opportunity to others here and from our audience to pose questions.
Thank you for this talk. I guess this is a little too deep for me, but my question would be, how is this different to marginal utility model? If you may elaborate, and also if you can explain a little bit harmony algorithm, Cockshott's harmony algorithm.
Okay. The answer to the second question is I can't really explain the harmony algorithm. That's unfortunately something you'll have to ask him about. So I'm not really, I don't really work on sort of improving optimization methods, right? I'm just working on how to apply them in a socialist economy. So unfortunately, I can't tell you any details about how the harmony algorithm works differently from sort of conventional linear programming. With regards to marginal utility, I mean, there's certainly some influence of sort of this sort of marginal utility neoclassical models here, right? But of course, they usually work with or assume a market economy where people exchange goods, and that's not really something you have here. You have it to some extent with consumer goods, right? These are being marketed to consumers in some way, but you don't have this between enterprises and with the means of production or raw materials or things like that, because they are not being exchanged between individual enterprises. Instead, you calculate an optimal production plan for the entire economy, and then enterprises are kind of instructed to follow this sort of general plan for the economy, right?
You described the linear economy eventually arriving at an ideal situation. I wondered what this ideal situation is and who decides what it is, and if it's at all possible to have an ideal situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is, of course, I mean, a quite narrow sort of mathematical formulation of a problem, okay? And what an optimal solution to this kind of problem is an optimal solution is always one which maximizes some function. And as I explained, this function which is being optimized in this model is sort of a function which tells you how much stuff is being produced, okay? So basically, you're trying to produce as many consumer products as possible within certain limits, within the limits of the available resources and available production methods, available technology, right? And then also any other constraints that people might decide on. So for example, they might decide we want to limit CO2 emissions to prevent global warming. And we don't want to emit more than a certain amount. And this could also be all kinds of other constraints that people might decide on, okay? And the computer then just basically calculates how to produce as much stuff as is possible under these constraints. And that's what I call sort of an optimal solution. Okay.
I have a few questions. The first is, how do you actually start? At the beginning, you had this, what was the name of the first step in your plan? Yeah, exactly. And so you seemed already to know these proportions.
Yeah.
How do you know them at the beginning? So that's the...
Yeah, so in my simulations, I've just sort of set them basically. And that's what you'd have to do, right? So you'd have to start off with some proportions at which the economy would start off. And what I would suggest is if you transition from a capitalist economy to this kind of socialist economy, what you would do is you would look at, well, at what proportions have we been producing these things so far? And then you start off with that, and then you adapt it from there, basically, right? So that's the idea. And you could do the same with prices as well. So you also need some initial price, which then gets adapted in response to consumer demand. And there you could also start off with what prices have been so far, or start off with sort of a reasonable estimate of what a reasonable price would be for this kind of product. Yeah.
Thanks. So it seems that this is the same question that we already have actually addressed today.
Yeah, this afternoon.
Regarding, yeah. And the second question is, you said that it would work only for a kind of static economy where you don't have economic growth. So I guess it wouldn't work in the economy in which you want on purpose to have degrowth.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a significant limitation at the moment, and basically what's the case in the simulation, and I've just done this for simplicity reasons because it'd be a lot more complicated to build these dynamic factors in. I don't think it's impossible to do at all. It would just be significantly more complex when you do it. But basically what happens in my model is that there's certain kind of like what you might call capital stock, like, you know, number of steel furnaces, for example, that are just fixed. And I assume that as these are degraded through use, they automatically get sort of repaired or replaced. Okay. And because I make this assumption, you never really change the capital stock because you always just replace it. You can't grow it. You can't increase the number of I don't know, solar panels, for example, and you also can't shrink the number of coal power plants, for example, right? But of course, that's precisely what you would want to do when transitioning towards away from fossil fuels, right? So what I'm really more looking at is sort of this short-term window in which you don't really change the capital stock. You just, so I'm more interested in this sort of short-term planning. And the reason I'm interested in this is because I think this is where you need some kind of mechanism so that real consumer behavior can be taken into account and fed back into the planning process, right? For long-term plans, you can't do that anyway, because you don't know what people are gonna want to consume in 30 years' time, right? So that's my reason for like sort of more looking at this sort of short-term planning, because I think for long-term planning, you already have to do that anyway. The market doesn't tell you what's needed in 30 years. Okay, so I think it's a much sort of simpler problem in a sense, because it's already what is being done and what we'd have to continue to do. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And my last question is, how is this model that you've proposed related to the system of the valuation of work that we were talking about today? So does this system work only in the case in which prices of work are fixed per hour, or
Right.
does it also work for where work is also with the work market, labor market?
Okay, so when implementing this in the computer simulation, another simplification which I made was that I just assumed that everyone has an equal number of sort of credits which they can use to purchase consumer products. Okay, so everyone just has exactly the same. There's no consideration of who's working, who's not working, how much, what kind of job, anything like that. Okay. So, but that's just a simplification because I needed to distribute the tokens somehow, and I thought, well, why not just distribute them equally? But in reality, you could, of course, do it in many different ways, and that's also something I discussed more detailed in my thesis. But yeah, I mean, so this would be compatible with sort of any pattern of distribution of these credits that you might want. Yeah. So you could pay everyone equally for the same hours of work, or you could pay them differently depending on the kind of work they do. That's really not specified. I just made the simplified assumption that everyone just has the same for the purpose of the simulation. But that's changeable quite easily. Yeah.
I was wondering, how would an economic model like this adapt to crisis situations? For example, like the corona crisis now, when people cannot go to work.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So it depends on the nature of the crisis, right? But what happens in a lot of like these situations is, of course, you have some sudden change of circumstances, right? Maybe during a storm, certain production processes you just can't do them, right? Or maybe if there's a drought, you plan for lots of corn being produced this year, but suddenly there's no corn because of the drought. So what would have to be done in these instances is that you'd, as soon as possible, change the parameters in the model, right? To say, well, actually we can't, we won't be having this much corn, or we can't be producing that day because of the storm. Or in the case of the corona crisis, we might say, actually for a couple of weeks now, we're going to have to close like most unessential factories. So they're just not going to be there at all, right? And then you have to calculate a new production plan based on these new assumptions. So that's basically what you'd have to do. Yeah. And I mean, in general, you would want to update this with up-to-date information about these kinds of things as often as possible, right? So that you don't end up sort of working with a production plan which might have been up to date like a year ago, but is completely based on completely wrong assumptions by now, right? So you constantly want to sort of change this and calculate new up-to-date production plans.
Now I will ask the same question that I already asked earlier today, but this is like more for the people who are following us on live stream. You have not said anything about the reasons why we would actually need this model. So why it is better than the market model. Also regarding the consideration of emissions, because the capitalists also have, or at least think to have, a market-based solution to this problem.
Yeah. So there are a couple of reasons. The first I would label under sort of the umbrella term market failures, right? So markets work fine in under some idealized assumptions, but in reality there are a lot of problems with them. Okay, and part of that, of course, has to do with what one might call externalities. So capitalist enterprise just doesn't care whether its emissions cause global warming or not, right? And there are ways that you can sort of try to deal with that within capitalism, carbon taxes, emission constraints, and so on, right? But I think, and I mean, this goes more into the question also of long-term planning, right? I think that in the end, this is the scale of the problem that we face with having to adapt our entire economy to a completely different way of producing energy. Is so massive that you need some kind of mobilization of and direction of resources, which I guess is comparable to the kind of wartime mobilization you saw during World War I or World War II. And when you look at these historic examples, what you'll see is that the British government or the American government, they didn't trust, the market will deliver tanks, right? Instead, they started to plan the economy and they started directing capitalists. They did it without sort of expropriating the capitalists or taking their profits away, but nonetheless, they started planning the economy to make sure that resources get directed to where they are needed the most. And they also didn't say, oh, we don't have the money to pay for tanks or anything like that, right? They just made sure that the tanks were being produced. And I think the same kind of thing we have to do in terms of the climate crisis. The other reason I'm in favor of a socialist model is, I guess, a distributive reason. Under capitalism, if you own capital, if you own stocks in the stock market or something like this, then sure, you're doing great, right? Because you are getting a return on your investment simply because you're already rich, you already own capital, so you get even more money, right? And that, of course, creates a massive inequality, economic inequality in our society. And I think that's the fundamental reason why we have such an unequal society, and which is something that I think socialists, sort of since socialism existed, have been wanting to avoid, and which my model would also avoid, because the only sort of income people would have might be as reward for their work or because they need it, and are treated as sort of equal citizens to everyone else, but never as sort of interest on accumulated wealth or anything like that. Okay. So I think that's just another reason to support socialism. Yeah.
No more questions? Okay, then I will.
There's one in the back.
Okay.
I have a question, but that's maybe naive because I must say I didn't understand many things. But in this, how is it possible to combine this model with, let's say, a market model for some parts of the economy? I mean, for instance, you are certainly right with what you said about the energy system. Just today I've heard a podcast with, I think, former governor of the Bank of England, and it seems impossible to transform the economy under this capitalist science. But would it be possible to say we transform the energy system with a kind of wartime planning system, but we have other systems, for instance, other regions, for instance, in agriculture, where we stick to maybe other forms of markets. Is that possible, or would the system only work if it is completely implemented?
Well, it is, of course, possible to try something like that, and I think it might work depending on how far you're willing to go. I think a lot of it would be easier if production was nationalized or socialized under social control, because then you have a lot more leeway for planning processes in order to transition the economy, right? Yeah, I mean, you could only apply this to the energy or apply planning to the energy sector, and then keep capitalism going as normal. But then you'd only be fixing sort of one particular problem of the capitalist economy, which is sort of the energy crisis and maybe global warming. But you'd be leaving but you'd leaving unchanged all the other problems that you have under capitalism, which includes a lot of inefficiencies which come with the market, because corporations compete rather than cooperate, which has to do with all of the inequality, right? So if you look at the agricultural sector, you have a lot of exploitation of farm workers working on the fields. You also have environmental questions to do with agriculture. For example, the displacement of nutrients and the excessive use of pesticides and all these things, right? You can approach them by regulation, which is always sort of like the soft approach. But I think in the end, it's a more effective approach. Just say, well, no, we're not going to have a system which incentivizes these kind of practices in the first place, and which is instead oriented towards sort of social welfare and social goals rather than private profit maximization.
More questions? So then maybe the last one from me. I don't understand what is actually socialist in the model, because in theory, we could apply this model without socializing the production, right? We don't have to expropriate the capitalists.
Okay, so, well, I mean, it does make use of quite extensive planning of the entire economy, right? So in the end, enterprises are told what they have to produce in accordance with the plan. So of course, we could now leave these enterprises under private ownership, and maybe their profit goes to private capitalists. But I mean, at this point, it really becomes strange why we would still be paying the capitalists their interest on their capital, when they're not even responsible for organizing production in any way anymore. I mean, even if you're just if you just own stock as a capitalist, you're probably not really doing that anyway, right? But at least in theory, capitalists still have this job of allocating capital. In this model, they don't have even that job anymore. So it hardly seems justified to still be paying them simply for, owning something, which could also just be owned by everyone in common.
Yeah, of course, I totally agree with you. But the question is, let's say at some point capitalists themselves see that the market model makes huge problems, including environmental problems that are then problems for them as well. So imagine that they say, well, we could just take this model and plan our production without changing ownership relations. And for me, it is much more realistic scenario, because that wouldn't need a revolution. They would just say, wow, these socialist guys have really cool planning tools. We just take them and have more efficient economy and still have our profits and our so that's easier to do than to realize, to materialize your model. So
yeah, I think that's entirely within the realm of possibility. And I mean, in a sense, we're already seeing this, that big firms like Amazon are using more and more sort of computer technology to plan logistic processes, but also oftentimes suppliers and production processes of suppliers and so on, right? So we are seeing this in a sense already. And yes, I mean, in some sense, at least some of the methods that I'm using, I mean, they have long been used under capitalism and for a very long time. But I guess the answer is, since that is also a possibility, maybe we need to have the revolution first and expropriate their capital before they can do that, so that we can do this in a way which benefits everyone, right?
Well, in that case, you would have to keep your model in secret until until revolution occurs.
It's a little late for that, but I mean, I think a lot of the methods that I work with, they are not new, and capitalists, they know about these kinds of things. What's new in my model is sort of the precise way that I implement it for a socialist economy, and but I think what the parts of it that can be applied under capitalism, I think a lot of it is already being taught in managerial schools, so they'll know about it anyway.
Well, if transposed to capitalist relations of production, this would be like a classical horizontal capitalism condition, where you don't have monopolies and monopsonies that dictate the price. They distort basically the level of collective demand and try to shape that demand to realize their investment. But that would also work under such a condition, where you have an ideal capitalist market with no market power, actually. No, that would be optimal price signaling depending on what the actual level of demand is, rather than tweaking it and modulating it to sort of realize sort of added investments that a capitalist might make, and then try to game the market to realize their power.
So you're talking about how sort of certain algorithmic algorithms are already being used by
I would say that so marginalist model really works in capitalism only when you have no monopoly power, when you don't have
Right.
market power, that distorts the pricing mechanism. No, it distorts the signals that actual level of demand sends toward production.
Right.
And that's also what your model in a way addresses, not necessarily for a capitalist mode of production, but simply it achieves the same level of optimization as capitalist political economists would sort of project into early capitalist relations or pre-monopoly capitalist relations.
Yeah. So I think what the model addresses. So if you have a monopoly under capitalism, the problem is they're gonna be charging high prices because they can and they want to make profit, right? In a sense, you have a complete monopoly under sort of socialized control in my instance, but they're not going to raise prices because there's no private profit, and instead this economy is being planned sort of with social interest in mind. So prices are going to be at clearing rates, and that's kind of the idea of the system, right? And that's how you avoid it. Yeah, so I agree with you that that's sort of one of the problems also that under capitalism that my model addresses. Yeah.
Another problem, or maybe not. In this model, it is actually the desires of the consumers that at the end tell or signal you how much should be produced of. But in a socialist society, maybe we should kind of educate our desires, or democratically decide about what is really necessary, and so not to let it just be the result of consumer choices, which themselves are influenced by capitalist ideology and consumerism. So how would you address that?
Sure. So I mean, there's a big question about sort of to what extent should we sort of consciously shape people's desires, demands, and so on, right? And obviously, I don't think we should be doing it through like sort of capitalist advertising, which basically is supposed to generate demand and tell people they need something, even if they don't actually just generate profit. That would make no sense within my model. I guess the same discussion, and I don't really sort of have a clear horse in this race yet. This discussion that still does need to be had is to what extent do we, for example, educate children to develop certain preferences or something like this, right? And I mean, that's a huge discussion in political philosophy about this, to what extent education should be sort of neutral about these kinds of things, so that children sort of develop their own preferences, or to what extent there are certain preferences that we should be educating children towards, right? I think people who are on either side of this debate can find something about my model that they can find reasonable, no matter how they stand on this. Yeah.
Also, very, very naive question, but is it possible to, let's say, to integrate a kind of ecological thinking into this model, where, for instance, I say I want to regenerate CO2. I want to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. I want to have an increase in biodiversity in a certain region. I see what I do economically as a part of a, let's say, not only human system. or whole. Would that be, let's say, what I've understood is in your model, in the end, you produce a certain amount of goods for people. Could this, let's say, holistic approach be integrated, or is that something totally different? Or could that be modeled in starting from that model?
So my model is, of course, not going to tell you sort of how do you increase biodiversity. That's something I defer to an ecologist on, right? But what the model can do is, if ecologists tell us that in order to preserve some species, we have to leave sort of this forest alone and we can't sort of bulldoze it, right? Which seems reasonable. I'm not an ecologist, but I assume that's often how species go extinct. Then this can be built into the model. If we then decide, you know, we want to preserve this species, so we're not going to bulldoze this forest, this can be built into the model as sort of a constraint, which basically tells the computer, this land is off limits, right? We can't like bulldoze this forest. And the computer will then have to find an optimal production plan which produces as much as possible without bulldozing that forest, right? This is basically the same approach I have with greenhouse gas emissions, right? Where you democratically decide we're not going to be emitting more than a certain amount of CO2. And then the computer has to live with that and calculates a production plan which optimizes production without violating these democratically decided constraints. And you could do that with all kinds of ecological concerns that people might have. It doesn't make the decision. Obviously, the algorithm can't tell you whether, you know, what species should be preserved and what we have to do to preserve biodiversity. But it can tell you what to produce under certain constraints, and these constraints can reflect whatever needs to be done to preserve biodiversity.
I hope that this is my last question. This is also something that during Utopian Incubator we discussed with you, and I would like to get a definite answer to that question. So what is supposed to be one of the advantages of the capitalist economy, or what we are told, as at least is it's one of the main advantages, is that it promotes innovation. So the capitalists have interest in innovating, and how does innovation, or why would innovation occur in your model? What is the incentive to?
Yeah, so I mean, innovation is sort of a huge umbrella term, and there could be loads of different things under that. One would be maybe like something like product innovation, where you invent new products. Something entirely different might be sort of innovating in terms of how things are being produced, or often, especially sort of the Austrian school of economics, when they criticize socialism, they have more in mind sort of you know, local business idea or something like this, which could also be a kind of innovation. Okay. And I mean, the answer would be different depending on sort of what kind of innovation you're talking about. But let me maybe address the first one, which is product innovation. One sort of huge example of the last sort of couple of years or decades at this point is the iPhone, obviously, right? This huge invention. And by a capitalist, profit-oriented firm, Apple. You know? But what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of the technology that went into that was actually funded by the state and by NASA in particular. So a lot of this sort of basic research which goes into these new kinds of products is already being done by the state and has to be done by the state, because a private company would never invest in this basic research because it's often something you can't patent. You can't patent the laws of nature, for example. So once these are sort of discovered and out, everyone can use them equally. So no company has an interest in investing money into researching, basic laws of physics, for example, while the state then has to take on this role. So we have that anyways. But of course, what capitalism does kind of do is create an incentive to then sort of use whatever innovation is available to develop new kinds of products, which actually meet some sort of consumer demand or create some new consumer demand which didn't previously exist. Yeah. And this is then often left to private enterprises, and sometimes there are sort of these sort of little startups, and I think we have to find a way to maybe mimic that. So we sort of harness everyone's sort of innovative ideas in some way. But a lot of it, and this is certainly the case in the case of the iPhone, is being developed by employees of these huge capitalist companies. They are employees, right? And I see no reason whatsoever why they shouldn't be able to do the exact kind of work inventing these new ingenious products, working for a state-owned company instead, right? What does it matter to them whether Apple is owned by private shareholders or by sort of the state or society as a whole, right? So I think, often people sort of attribute these kinds of invention to these individual people like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or whoever it is, right? I think that takes a lot of credit away from the engineers who are actually doing the work of inventing these kinds of things. And there's no reason why they shouldn't continue to do it under socialism.
Fitting to this question, I think what binds those employees is a kind of corporate culture. And I wonder if that stays the same in this kind of economic model, because there's somehow, they would be different if they all belong to the state, I guess. And it's the culture that's this invisible bond between those people that work on the same product, I would say.
Yeah, so maybe company cultures will change. I mean, cultures are also different in various companies, right? And I guess this is a challenge which any company, which any economic system has, and which certainly under socialism won't disappear, is how do we create these cultures which encourage innovation within companies, right? Yeah, my model is not an answer to that problem. My model addresses different kind of problems, but it's certainly something which would still have to be addressed. But I don't see sort of a principal reason why it shouldn't be possible to sort of create a culture of innovation and also certain incentives of innovation. I don't see a problem, for example, with people being rewarded in some sense. It shouldn't be sort of this, they shouldn't be billionaires that go into space, right? But I don't see a problem with sort of having some kind of incentive also and reward for people who come up with innovative ideas. I think something like that is certainly needed in order to foster innovation. Yeah. And there's no reason it shouldn't be under socialism.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would suggest that we finish for today. Thank you very much, Jan Philipp. It was great for me, the whole day, also our previous discussion during the seminars. I'm also very glad that Tomislav Medak, who will lecture tomorrow, has joined us here and listened to your lecture and also took part in the discussion. And also thanks to all visitors. There are not many of them, but there are a nice group here, and I hope that we also had some visitors on a live stream. And come tomorrow, you're welcome, and we will be glad to see you. Tomorrow at the same time, we will have a Tomislav Medak's lecture, and I'm already looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Anna, for inviting me. I had a great time as well, also doing the Utopian incubator, and yeah, I wish you all the best with the rest of the Utopie-Schule and then the Utopie-Labor next week as well. All right, thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.